Xenoblade X is finally real, the Wii U is dead, Elma is back on the Nintendo Switch this upcoming March, all the birds are chirping, all the traffic is loud and proud on this random Tuesday morning. We've all assembled in excitement over this game we've been begging for 7 years. Think about that, since the beginning of the Switch, and now at the ends of the Switch, we've finally been granted our wish. Whether they're a Xenoblade fan or not, there's so many people ready to jump into Xenoblade X for the first time, and I cannot wait. It's a phenomenal game, but if this is your first time, there's something important that you should know. Because we got a couple months until March, and I think that's enough time to process what I'm about to discuss right now. Because it seems like X, with all this demands, with all this port begging, it has gained kind of almost a mythical status, where you see nothing but praise for that game, and everybody is just so focused on getting it back on the Switch, that they kind of ignored what that game actually is. They don't really know what X is, besides the fact that it's a giant mech in an open world. And hey, if that's enough for you to buy the game, that's great, because I would love for it to sell well. But I would also, ideally, would like you to enjoy the game too. and if you're going in with improper expectations, then you're going to be a lot less likely to do so. In fact, I know there might be disappointment, because this has already happened before. X was a very polarizing game when it first released. You don't really hear about that nowadays with how romanticized it is. And hey, to be fair, it was on the Wii U, so I don't blame anybody for not knowing that, okay? But you probably know about how divisive Xenoblade 2 was, and still is to a certain extent. Well, believe it or not, the same exact thing happens with Xenoblade X. We may as well start with the fact that if you love this original trilogy on the Nintendo Switch, then that does not mean that you're going to love Xenoblade X. X is just so fundamentally different in so many ways, even at surface level. Starting with the soundtrack. You might have heard about that one. The soundtrack is so different. It is not like the trilogy at all. It's all done by one composer, one man. The man, the myth, the legend. Hiroyuki Sawano, a legend of anime specifically. And I feel like, considering there's still a section of Xenoblade fans who like to pretend they're not a weeb, there's this odd section that don't want to admit that every game is anime as hell. If you're one of those people, then I definitely think you might not like X's soundtrack. X's soundtrack is super anime, and it's great if you're into that, like me, but some of you might be thrown off. Wow, I almost forgot to mention the most important difference from the trilogy, and that X is not a story-driven game. If you play Xenoblade and many other JRPGs for the story, then you are not going to get what you want out of X. X does have a main story, and it's pretty cool sometimes, but overall, it's fine. It's definitely one of those games where you get a lot more by doing the side quests. There's actually some pretty unique world building, but you can't just approach it like any other Xenoblade game. If you just want the main campaign to be solid, you're not gonna get that here whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't compare X to other Xenoblade games. In fact, I think there's one comparison that is so blatant, yet just for some reason, maybe through all the romanticism, it's just extremely overlooked. And that is, for better or worse, to Xenoblade 2. It's just been so weird. It's been so bizarre to be sitting back here, watching all these people hate on Xenoblade 2. They loathe Xenoblade 2, and yet they're also begging for Xenoblade X, completely oblivious, just completely unaware that Xenoblade X started so many of those reasons why you hate Xenoblade 2. I think that's why I love Xenoblade 2 since the beginning. It's because I already dealt with some of that in Xenoblade X, so why would I be thrown off? Like, this is not this is not at left field for me. Like, yeah, of course it's like this. First and foremost, we've already touched on this a bit. Anime. Xenoblade X is incredibly anime. It's right up there with Xenoblade 2. It's just not as explicit. It's not as honest. Like, you can look at Xenoblade 2's box art, and you know that's really anime, right? But even though there aren't sexualized, wacky, default character designs, oh, they're there. They're actually worse in Xenoblade X. There are some insane outfits, over the top as hell, in Xenoblade X. They just happen to be all optional, so most people aren't going to be aware at first glance. You could argue that it was worse. You could say that it was more egregious, because in the original Japanese version, one of the main characters was 13 years old, and they had some questionable outfits. Now, in the Western release, they censored those outfits, and they scaled up her age a bit. But yeah, that was not great, I would say. I would think the changes for better. Some people were very upset. You know the type of people I'm talking about, who scream about any kind of censorship. And I'm sure they'll be back. They will return for Xenoblade X Definitive Edition. You will see them at some point in your life, and I want you to know that it's okay. You don't have to engage. It's not worth it. Just me talking about this is just... ugh. It's also quite anime in terms of the humor. Like, this is where Nopons became a lot more comedic and cartoony. They were already somewhat like that in Xenoblade 1, but you know, they had like a whole civilization and the frontier village and all that. X is where they definitely became solidified as the cartoony mascot. Hell, even now, with how romanticized X is, the community still considers Tatsu to be the worst Nopon in the entire franchise. Now, I personally think it's a little bit exaggerated, a little bit overhated, but I guess I tend to have more patience with the Nopon. Like, I don't think they're that annoying, to be honest. Maybe that's just me, but overall, though, I'd say the style of humor is pretty similar to Xenoblade 2, so if you like that, you probably won't mind it here. I will say, though, that it's worse. There's definitely some moments that made me laugh, for sure. Don't get me wrong. And you don't have to worry about it in the main story. Unlike 2, the main story is just consistently serious. Except for a notorious joke about eating Tatsu. Every chapter, they have to joke about eating Tatsu. And it's never funny. Not even the first time. But they keep doing it. And that by itself is funny, but not the joke. One of my lights just died, so I'm sorry if it looks a little weird now. I thought it was full battery, my bad. Let's move on to the gameplay. The gameplay is very important in this case, because, yes, as a whole, it is more reminiscent to Xenoblade 1, but if you remember the key elements that made Xenoblade 2's gameplay divisive, if you think about the things that were kind of a pain, maybe a major pain, even as a Xenoblade 2 fan, well, guess what? They started with X. What is the number one thing that everybody agrees on when it comes to Xenoblade 2? Aside from Pyra/Mythra being hot, what is the number one thing, whether you love that game or not? The number one thing we all agree on is the tutorials. They are notoriously bad. But the funny thing is, they're worse in Xenoblade X! Xenoblade X's tutorials are so bad that I beat the game twice and I still don't know half of the mechanics. Xenoblade X's tutorials are so bad that the main gimmick of the battle system, the thing that separates it from every other Xenoblade game, is a mechanic that isn't even explained! At least Xenoblade 2 tried! And not only are the tutorials worse, but what makes that worse is that Xenoblade X has the most complicated gameplay out of any of the Xenoblade games. So if you're one of the people who thought Xenoblade 2 was overly complicated, too many mechanics, if you're one of the people especially who just think Xenoblade in general, all of them are too complicated, well, you're in for a rude awakening with Xenoblade X. I guarantee there's going to be people buying X just because it's a big mech in a big world, just to realize they're gonna need a big amount of tutorials before they get to that big robot. Now, obviously, we are talking about the definitive edition. Surely this won't be as much of an issue. Surely there will be a lot of quality of life updates, which, just like Xenoblade 2, you definitely wish there were quality of life in the original version. Xenoblade X had just a bunch of like little things that were inconvenient, like for example, the text. The text is so small for no reason. The party members. There's a lot of optional party members, similar to how Xenoblade 3 you have all the heroes. In X, it's not just a menu. No. It's not a menu where you pick. You have to find them in the overworld to add them every time to your party. I'm sure at least that there will be a quality of life feature. But the point is that, yeah, this is also a game where you better hope that there's a lot of quality of life added to it. Last but not least, this is nowhere near the most egregious example, but I wanted to end with a direct example. Something that literally transferred, no questions about it, even the term, straight into Xenoblade 2. And that is the field skills. Xenoblade 2, it's a lot more prevalent, because they have to do with the blades. You know, they're a big thing. Sometimes they're required for the main story. 2, you have all that context. X, it's just there. It's just sometimes you run into an object and they're like, hey, are you this level for this thing? No? Okay, well, come back later. Nothing you should be worried about, but that is an example of where, yeah, they literally just inserted that into Xenoblade 2. With all that said and done, I want to emphasize, this is not a video about being a wet blanket. I'm not trying to put a damper on anybody's excitement. I just want people to have an accurate idea of what this game is, and to also have some sort of expectation on what the definitive edition would hopefully fix and improve. I just don't want history to be repeated. I really hated, with both X and 2, I just hated all the discourse about, oh, this game isn't what I expected, ah, boo-hoo. I don't care to see that. And I have this big fear that it's gonna happen again. Because now, especially with this trilogy, you know, I don't think it's gonna be as bad as it was on the Wii U. But now that we have the trilogy, I feel like so many fans love Xenoblade and call it peak because of the story, because of the music, because of all these things that are unanimous among this trilogy. But they're not gonna be there for X. You need to understand that now, so that you can enjoy the game later. So many people who don't like Xenoblade, they still want X because they see that little robot, little, you know, relatively walking around, flying around. Wow, I can't wait to do that. Well, you are gonna wait. When that day comes on March 20th, I believe, you're gonna wait a little longer to finally get that robot, okay? I just need you guys to understand that now, so you have the best chance of enjoying that game when it finally comes out. Because like I said, Xenoblade X is a game for a very specific type of person. And honestly, odds are, you probably aren't that type of person. But it's still worth trying. Because if you are that type of person, it really is a magnificent, special experience that deserves to get a second chance. But not just a second chance, a second, honest, genuine, unbiased chance. Don't let history repeat itself, please.